The novel is called Birthright. It's set in about 400 years in the future after something that is not well understood happened, something apocalyptic where 99% of the human race disappeared in what's called the runaway.
Welcome to Story Power, a new bi-monthly podcast where my guests and I geek out about the stories we are passionate about in all different genres, styles, and formats. And we'll give a few recommendations to you, our listeners. Beware possible spoilers ahead. My name is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden, and I started this podcast during the COVID-19 pandemic. As I watched the reaction of my social media circle, I noticed that many people turned to stories for comfort and help in making sense of the craziness going on around them. And as all good stories do, the world got even crazier. But as Neil Gaiman says, fairy tales are more than true not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. Since I believe that stories have the power to show us the way and give us courage to keep going, I wanted to see if that was true for my guests as well. You're listening to episode number 5. My guest today is Randy Murray. This is the second part of a conversation that we started in the last episode where Randy was telling about a novel that he's writing. I wanted to go back to you telling about your novel because it sounded really interesting. Tell us about your novel.
Certainly. The novel is called Birthright. It's set in about 400 years in the future after something that is not well understood happened, something apocalyptic where 99% of the human race disappeared in what's called the runaway. And what happened during the runaway was that something, nobody is sure exactly what, unleashed into humanity a connectedness that connected them all to a great repository of human knowledge. The way I explain it is if you think of the Library of Alexandria, but it's updated and it contains all of human knowledge, every bit of human knowledge. And there's a team of librarians there that you can ask about anything, and that information is delivered to you. But even more so, for any question or statement that you make or even think, there's a pesky librarian right behind you, taps you on the shoulder and says, well, that turns out not to be the case, and then presents you with the evidence. So essentially, if you are faced with, you can't lie to yourself. You can't make up things because you are held up to this mirror of the soul that shows you everything you are and all you've done and everything you've thought or believed and what is true. My story is set 400 years in the future, and the remnants of humanity are living in what appears to be a paradise. But is it a paradise, and are you still human if you can't lie and people can't lie to you because you're presented with the truth? And are you still human if there is nothing but, utterly what's in front of you? And can you still tell stories? Can there still be fiction? And what if somebody decided that they didn't want the world that way? They wanted it back the way it was. So I'm kind of working through, some of those things as I work through the story. And, it takes place in 3 components. The first one's called home. The second one is called the road, because there's a journey. And then the third one is called the city. So it's 3 parts of the novel.
Oh.
So I'll have to get after it and get my lousy first draft, because I find a lot of stuff. If you take off the governors, if you let go of the brakes and you just let go and write, the characters say and do the damnedest things.
I know,
things
right?
that I did not expect, and I'd say, where did that come from? And what are you doing? And get back in line, and no, they misbehave, and it's sometimes it's frustrating, and you write yourself into a corner and you have to walk away and work on another part. It's a challenge, but get it all out fast, and then you can, take the tools and begin working on it.
One of the things that was the hardest for me in the first novel that I wrote was when I realized that one of the characters I really liked was going to have to die.
Yeah.
It was like, oh no, I don't want that to happen. It was kind of heartbreaking. And then I realized, but where the story wanted to go, that had to happen. He had to die. So
yeah. And I think that's part of it, is learning what are the demands of the story, not what I want.
Mm-hmm.
If all the stories that we wanted to come it ends nice, everybody's happy, it's all gumdrops and roses, and we realize, wow, I'm tired of this stuff. You get tired of it fast. The stories that really touched me when I was a child,
mm-hmm.
The Grimm's fairy tales, in their original glory, and the mythologies of all different people.
Yeah.
There are horrendous things that happen.
Yes.
One of the stories that struck me at the time, and I find myself coming back to it over and over, is the story of Prometheus. The story of this god who decided, look at humans down there, and they're groveling and they're cold and they're wet and they don't know anything. And Zeus says, I can't do anything, but screw him. I'm going to give them fire, which of course changes everything for the lowly humans, but Zeus takes it out of him in an excruciating manner. And you just, you look at it and say, oh my God. But there are so many things in that story, about, him being chained to a rock and having his liver ripped out every day for it to be regrown. And, I read that as a child. Children, parents hate to find this out, but children are bloodthirsty little creatures. I loved it. And, oh my God, what does that mean? What is he doing? Is anyone going to save him? And those are the kind of things that stayed with me. And, you think about those, just as, you think about Sisyphus, rolling the damn rock up the hill.
Oh, see, I was going to mention Sisyphus.
Yeah. Think about this thing.
Yeah, Velma Rouge. I took a couple of classes with Velma, and she talked about Sisyphus, and she said, just think about him. And so I did for years and years and years about why could someone find meaning from rolling this rock up a hill and then letting it go down again and then having to roll it up again. And one day I was doing the dishes. We didn't have a dishwasher, so I was hand washing the dishes, and across the street, this is when we lived in Portland, there was this beautiful tree, and it was kind of dancing in the wind. And it was like, oh, I get it. Because I hated doing the dishes. It was like rolling that rock up the hill all the time. And I got to look at that tree when I was doing the dishes. And I realized, oh, Sisyphus gets to stand at the top of that hill and look around, and maybe there's beauty around him. And then he gains strength from that, and then he can go down and roll the rock back up again.
Yeah, and we were probably, if I weren't in that class, I was in another edition of it. It was probably, Dr. Rouge probably was having us read Camus and the Myth of Sisyphus.
Oh, I had to read The Plague. Yeah, and my story with Velma Rouge, who was one of the real fine professors that I ever had a chance to study under. When I came in as a freshman, and I'm going through all of the, signing up the final things to get classes, I learned that there were, advanced literature courses available, but they were only available to juniors and seniors. So me, little farm boy, not knowing any better, marched right up to the table where Dr. Velma Rouge sat, and I had never met her before. And I said, I'm coming in as a freshman and I want to take your course. She said, oh, well, it's just for juniors and seniors. You need to have a background. I said, yeah, no, I've looked at the books you have listed, and I'm
I've read many of them and I'm very interested and I want to take your course. And we stood there and went back and forth until she said, okay, give it a shot, see what you can do.
Wow, that's so great.
And she was just, I took every literature course that she offered. And this is back when I was still supposed to be studying biology and chemistry. And the things that she had to say about religion and literature and modern literature and all those things and mythology are, some of the real foundations and me as a thinker. So I, really have to thank her for letting me in that first class.
Yes. Oh, yes. She was fabulous. I loved her. So you also are a playwright and you play the ukulele.
That's right.
That's so fun. It's fun watching the pictures of you playing the ukulele on Facebook.
Oh, yeah. I highly recommend it to everyone. Any musical instrument, but the ukulele in particular is a lot of fun to pick up. And the sales, I've been watching, sales of musical instruments, and ukulele in particular, have spiked in the first part of this year as people are at home with nothing to do and are learning new things. And so I highly recommend it. Talk about plays, a current play that I'm working on, and you mentioned earlier about the Greek chorus, which brought to mind the project I'm working on. I'm here in a town just outside Columbus, Ohio, and one of the native sons here is the author James Thurber, who's he was born in Columbus, and some of his early work, comic work, is about Columbus. And so I'm working on a play about him and his friend, John McNulty, who almost nobody knows, but who was a brilliant writer, did work for the New Yorker and others. And it's about their relationship and, how they, as friends, about, they were really very different people and looking at them. But one of the things I discovered, James Thurber was a horrible person. And even though he's lauded and held up in here in Columbus by being a great writer and an artist and a very fundamental person in the development of things like the New Yorker and the New Yorker style of comedy and cartooning, he was just an awful person. And when I read about him and about McNulty, the first thing I discovered was a little book called This Place on 3rd Avenue, which is a collection of John McNulty's short stories and reporting. And there's a foreword by McNulty's wife. He passed away, he had a heart attack, and he passed away in the 50s. And she told the story, went through the story of his life. And while I'm reading about this and reading about Thurber, and then I said, wow, that's interesting. And I went to see what Thurber had to say about McNulty, and they were two different things. Thurber told a different story about McNulty. And I began digging into it. And, there's some fascinating things. And so when I'm writing the play and the first act, which does stand alone as a one-act play, is set in the 20s in a speakeasy in Columbus, Ohio, as Thurber's about to leave to go to France and write the great American novel, which we all know he never did. And McNulty is there, and there's a crowd of characters. And I didn't plan this, but as I'm writing it, I began to discover that everybody else there, other than these two main characters, were the chorus. And they could say things that needed to be said.
Yes.
And with some also recognition that, they may not be the protagonists in the story. Each one of them thinks they are, but they also realize that they have something more to say. So, we'll see how that all works out.
Well, I was going to say that's so interesting because earlier when we did the other recording, we were talking about Star Trek, and there's that wonderful episode in Star Trek: The Next Generation of the chorus speaking for the man who's deaf and dumb, but who
I just saw that episode this week.
The negotiator. And when he's so crippled when they all are killed until... Is it Troy that helps him figure that out?
Troy helps him to learn to communicate.
Yes.
And that's his discovery,
Yes. And so there's that. And then when you were talking about Thurber being a horrible person, one of the books that I absolutely love, and she wrote a whole series of these, is The Mists of Avalon. And recently I found out that she was not such a nice person. And it,
Yeah.
and it was like, oh, because I love that whole series of books that she wrote about after the Miss of Avalon. There's the Forest House is one of them. And when I found that out, it was like, well, what do you do with that information when you find out that the author that you absolutely love was not such a very nice person?
It's difficult, and fortunately, as a matter of fact, E.B. White said of him, James Thurber was the sweetest, kindest person you would ever meet until 5 o'clock. Of course, that's cocktail hour. And
Right.
you had mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird. So Harper Lee and her childhood friend was Truman Capote.
Right.
Well, when Truman Capote was very young and just getting to New York, he got a job at the New Yorker, and his job was basically to chauffeur around James Thurber, who by then was probably completely blind, and take him back and forth from the offices and to his mistresses and various other places. And of course, Capote, found that both amusing and extremely distasteful at the same time.
That sounds like an interesting play.
Theater there's so many opportunities, and they don't all have to be in established theaters and buildings and on Broadway and other places like that. There's so many colleges around that are thirsty for new material that they're a little leery of. They don't, it's risky to produce new material.
Yeah.
One of my plays, somebody I went to grad school was in the theater department from a little college in Texas, Howard Payne University. And she took one of my plays. It's pretty brave because it's a very complex play. And they did a beautiful job with it. I was really pleased with that. And in 2013, they decided and got the opportunity to go to the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh. And they said, we want to take your play, but it can only be, I think it had to be less than 90 minutes in one act. And it may have been shorter than that, which is, the play was, 2 acts and 2.5 hours. And I said, great. And I sat down to rework it, see whether I could cut and compress, and ended up writing 2 new versions. One, which could be performed inside the required time, and another one that could be performed as a piece of street theater. And it was those constraints. When you have anything is possible in the world, do whatever you want. Well, that suddenly you go, I don't know what I want to do. But if you say, I'm going to give you a piece of chalk and this much rope, go. What can you do with it? Helps me to become more creative and to solve problems. And now I have 3 different versions of the play that could be done in any particular way. And I that was a real awakening to me of saying, there is not just one form for any one thing. And, and at a point, I'm done with it, and now somebody else gets to make something out of it.
Yes.
And I have a standing offer. Nobody's taken me up on it recently, but I will offer my material free of charge to anybody that wants to produce it, as long as they're not charging admission.
Yeah, we aren't quite sure about that in our club, because part of our thing is you got to pay royalties most of the time. But if we don't have to pay you royalties, then we might be able to do that. Yeah.
There you go. So come and see me when you're ready, and we'll put something together for you.
So I was thinking that maybe you could recommend a story to our listeners, that something that really touched you and that you recommend a lot.
Well, I am going to recommend a couple of things here.
Okay.
I'm trying to think, where is up there? It is. I'm pulling things off of my bookshelf. Is Neil Gaiman's The Ocean at the End of the Lane.
Oh, yes, I've read that book.
And I happen to be, matter Matter of fact, back to Edinburgh I went along when they produced my play there, which was a thrill. But Neil Gaiman was there also, and I got to see him, and he read the first chapter of this book, and it was just, it just completely hooked me in, and I was lucky to be able to stand in line and get him to autograph my copy of American Gods, which is, I highly recommend. The Ocean at the End of the Lane is a story that is, you can't predict where it's going, but there's a moment in there, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but there was a moment in there that, and I've read it 3 times, and each time I catch my breath when I hit it, saying, oh no. It just completely sets you back when you realize, how the person is related inside the story and what all that means to him, and that he's going to be, it's going to come right back again. He's going to be, because he's been there before.
Yes.
It's the same way. And if you do get a chance to go to Broadway or wait until it comes out and see Hadestown, I mean, talk about story. It's basically the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice, which is one of our oldest tales. And it's straightforward. It's done in an exciting way. But you hit the end, and it ends the same way. They don't change the story. It ends the same way. And then they celebrate the story. It all happened before. It will all happen again. And it kind of brings us to a point of you're deeply, touched by the tragedy of the story. Yes. And yet you're elevated by the telling of it and realizing this is a part of us and a part of who we are as people.
Yeah.
I highly recommend The Ocean at the End of the Lane. It's a short read and done by a master storyteller. I would also recommend you could pick up his book on Norse mythology, which is a retelling of the Norse tales.
That one looks very interesting to me.
Oh, it is so good and so enlightening. So either Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology or Philip Pullman, who wrote the Golden Compass.
Yes, I love that series.
The Dark Materials trilogy, which is it's on HBO now, the first version of that. So he has 2 books from Philip Pullman. One is his version of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, but also a book about stories and storytelling. It's called Demon Voices. And it is remarkable. It is really, really good.
Yeah, I love Philip Pullman. He wrote some other things that I have seen on television that I said, I want to read those books.
Yeah, so I would recommend his book on stories and storytelling, Demon Voices. And then one other thing, which is about the subject as well, Jonathan Gottschall. It's called The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human. And I highly recommend that for anybody that wants to really take a look at, how stories shape us, and really terrific stuff.
Well, if I were going to name one, and this is one that I recommend a lot, it's a historical fiction, and it's Shogun by James Clavell.
James Clavell, one of my favorites.
And part of the reason I recommend it a lot is because when I read it the first time, and then I saw the miniseries, and I've read it again, and I probably will read it again. I don't read books very often, but it is a book that actually I felt like I was in Japan in the 1500s, and I understood their culture and their cultural structure and how different it is from ours. And there was something so admirable about it. Even though everyone was serving their master, everybody knew their role in the society, and in a way that freed them up to be themselves. And that was something that I had never really thought. Now, I read that book in the 80s, I think.
Yeah,
early
that's probably
90s.
when I first read it. It's been a long time ago, but all of those books, the James Clavell books, just absolutely terrific stuff.
Yes.
Which reminds me, have you read any of Patrick O'Brian's novels set in the Napoleonic War, the Age of Fighting Sail. There was a movie created out of kind of a mishmash of some of them called Master and Commander.
No, and I've never seen that movie either.
Oh, it's remarkable. But those books, there's 21 of them. It's several thousand, but it's actually just one long book. And it's I've heard described as if Jane Austen were to write naval stories.
Yeah, I might have to read them then.
And so you start with Master and Commander, and they're witty, and they're wonderful, and they're intricate. And when you get on board ships, one of the characters, the main character, is a doctor who's never set foot on a ship. So everything has to be explained to him repeatedly because he never gets it the first time. And what you find is that you learn all about, these sailing ships and remarkable things and how they're in battle and all of these wonderful things. And that's all beside the story itself and the friendship of these two men. But one of the things that and these are a series I've read multiple times, and I found it amusing. We were a few years ago, we're in Boston, and we had never went to see the Constitution, Old Ironside.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd never been on, a ship of that age. And so we went and we got paid our money, and we get in line, we go on a tour, and there's a young naval ensign, he probably is 19 years old, and he's giving the tour, and we're down on the gun deck, and people are asking questions, and he doesn't know, and he's getting flabbergasted. And I'm sitting there realizing, and I began answering the questions, and it was as if I had lived there. Because I had lived in those books, and without ever being there. What is this for? Oh, well, I can tell you what this is for. Here's how they use that, and how that's different in the American Navy than from the English Navy. And I had to shut myself up, or rather, because I wanted to take over the tour.
Yes. Oh, yes. I know that feeling. Yeah. Now, I don't know a lot about Navy either, or the Napoleonic era, but I do have a historical fantasy series that I absolutely love, His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik. And she has an air corps made up of pilots and dragons in the Napoleonic era. And it's there are 9 books, I think, in the series. And I just loved those. Because Lawrence, he's a naval captain, and they capture a dragon's egg from a French ship, and it's about to hatch. And so he's trying to get one of his officers to bond with the dragon. Well, of course, the dragon doesn't want to bond with that officer. He wants to bond with Lawrence. So Lawrence then has to become an airman. He has to leave the Navy and he knows nothing about how, because the dragons can talk, they're intelligent. This dragon happens to be an imperial dragon from China, so he learns how to read, and he can write, and it's just such a fascinating series. But yeah, the other Master and Commander, I'll have to think about that one. And the other one that I'm thinking about reading is Paul Dark, the Paul Dark series.
Yeah, I've seen Diane and I watched, I think, most of it. I don't think we've watched the last of it. But there's the Sharp series.
Oh, I love that too, and I haven't read those books either.
They're very good. Not as good. I mean, they're good in a more disposable way that you read that and say, well, that was fun, and you go on. You don't think much about it. The Patrick O'Brian ones are so elegantly and beautifully written. I mean, you don't have to know a thing coming into them, and he basically gives you everything in the course of the story without hitting you over the head with exposition. Right. So really well done.
It's nice to have a character who doesn't know anything, and that's a great plot device to use.
Oh yeah,
to inform.
And he, even though he's a brilliant man in his own way, he doesn't pay attention when people explain things to him. So he has to have it explained to him time and time again. And that's very helpful for the reader. You don't have to say, well, what did they tell him, 4
You're
novels ago?
right.
Yeah, because he still can't get it right. And, and so it's extremely helpful. And he's not, without making him a complete dunce. I mean, he is
Right.
a brilliant man in other ways, but outside of, that area, he doesn't care. So that's what really good storytelling does. It makes it possible for you to live in the story and not have to go flipping back or do research or, go to the internet and saying, what the heck is that?
Yeah, I like that too. So the other book that I read about the same time was Roots, and it did the same thing for me. It was I was on the ship. Oh, that part was so heartbreaking. And when I was teaching English, we read a portion of Oludo Equiano's biography. And it was the part about the middle passage. And it affected my students so deeply. Yeah. So
that's what good storytelling does. I mean, it changes us.
Yes.
We look at things, and I think television, which I think we're in a golden age of television, but I think television is regarded as disposable. You watch something or you have to pay attention and it goes by and it didn't matter. It doesn't affect us. It doesn't change anything. But good storytelling does. It changes us. And so this is, I call it the Tale of Two Cities era of television. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. So you can watch endless reality TV and, opinion news and all of this, and it is meaningless. It's sound and fury meaning nothing. Or you can watch some remarkable storytelling.
Yes.
You can, and be forever changed.
Right.
And I think that is the part that, that a good story is not disposable. You can't throw it away because it's stuck to you. And it doesn't mean that the story made you happy. Some of the best stories don't make you happy. They disturb you. They make you feel weird. They make you frightened, or they make you say, I need to know more because that doesn't seem right. And they cause you to take action. And that's what, the real power of story is, that it changes us.
Well, it makes us look at ourselves.
Yeah. So an endless subject. So I congratulate you on finding something you can talk about endlessly, because you will never exhaust it.
That's true. Talking about stories. Yeah. I had a 2-hour conversation with my sister, and we were talking about that exact same thing, that it's messy in the middle. The middle of the story is messy. And yes, you might get to a certain kind of resolution, but sometimes it's not pretty or the outcome that you would like, but you always can learn something from it.
Yeah. Philip Pullman talks about the path and the woods. If your story, if you stay on the path, if you keep your reader on the path, you can lead them through the woods. If things are too interesting and they wander off into the woods, you've lost them. They're gone. They're out exploring what's behind that bush over there, and they're not paying attention anymore. And that's perfectly fine for some types of entertainment and interactive things, but the storyteller has to keep them on the path.
Yeah. Well, I am so glad that we got to talk, and I want to have you on again because, as you said, this is a subject that could go on and on and on. And as your friend Aaron, how do you say it? Menke? Yeah. He talks about stories in a different way. Since his podcast is so popular, I think that the ones that are popular are the ones about stories where you could just keep talking and talking and talking forever. I'm hoping that maybe I will be able to have some people who can talk forever about story more than you and my sister and Dave Dahl. So
yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are going to want to talk about story.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it was fun. Happy to.
It was fun. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you liked what you heard, please share it with a friend and give us a review on your favorite podcast app. It will help people find us. You'll find the show notes for this episode on my website, Sage Woman Chronicles, at sagewoman.life. You can leave us a comment there. And remember, as Philip Pullman said, after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. Until next time, this is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden. Thanks for listening.